Model T rolled off the line every 10 seconds. Scientific management, new technology, and advertising, our tour guide pointed out, have made the automobile industry the greatest achievement of our time. We were impressed. Nearly 30 million cars crowded the country's roads by the end of the decade. Driving was an adventure, especially beyond the city limits. 98% of our roads were unpaved. Smart drivers always carried chains and a shovel in case they got stuck in the mud. New federal laws provided matching funds to states for road building, and thousands were hired to build them. We spent more money building highways in the 20s than was spent on any other industry. Arizona built a highway across the desert. New York built the Bronx River Parkway and the Holland Tunnel. Massachusetts paved the Mohawk Trail. By 1928, we could drive all the way from New York to Kansas on paved roads. By the end of the decade, we were building 10,000 miles of new roads and spending more than $1 billion every year. There was other new construction in the decade. We built new dams and hundreds of new hydroelectric plants. The amount of hydroelectric power produced more than doubled in the 20s. 2/3 of American homes had electricity by 1929. It was also a period of consolidation. Local utilities were swallowed by regional corporations. And by the end of the decade, 10 holding companies controlled nearly 3/4 of the nation's electric power. Prices went down as consumption went up. We needed more electricity for millions of new washing machines, toasters, lamps, and vacuum cleaners, radios, and telephones. We laid nearly 50 million miles of new telephone cable in the 20s and installed 10 million new telephones. Telephone linemen worked beneath city streets and in the air on poles that stretched along our new highways all across the country, connecting farms, villages, big cities, and towns. One of the most important technological developments of the 20s was radio. The first radios were called crystal sets, and we listened to the first broadcasts through earphones. Thousands were sold, and we took them everywhere. Radio quickly became big business. By 1923, an 8-tube RCA with 5 dials and a speaker cost $275. GE sold 11 million sets that year. There were other new developments. Dr. Francis Jenkins, a radio engineer and inventor living in Washington, D.C., conducted successful experiments in wireless transmission of pictures, which led to the first television broadcast in 1927. Station WGY in Schenectady began scheduled broadcasts in 1928, but television remained a curiosity for most of us in the 20s. More practical applications of technology, like refrigerated trucks and railroad cars, meant better diets for many Americans. Milk could be kept cold and shipped from farm to doorstep in a few hours. By 1926, milk production had increased by 1/3 as we equated more milk with better health. The homemaker of the 20s was concerned with good nutrition and her family's health. Many children were among the 500,000 Americans who died in the flu epidemic of 1918, and proper nutrition meant resistance to disease. Electric refrigerators provided the biggest changes in our kitchens. Refrigerators and a better knowledge of what made a balanced diet. With electric refrigerators, we could keep fresh foods longer at stable temperatures, and this meant more Americans ate meat and milk, fresh fruits and vegetables than ever before. While most families depended on an ice box and regular delivery of ice to keep food cold, nearly 1 million families bought electric refrigerators in the 20s. By the end of the decade, you could buy one for less than $300. In 1920, a first-class letter cost 2 cents. For some Americans, faster communication was important. A Chicago businessman could call his stockbroker in New York long distance for $3. But when most of us had news to share, we used the mail. Airmail and transcontinental delivery became regular services of the post office in 1924. By 1927, even Railway Express was shipping parcels by air. The government contracted with private airlines to carry the mail. For many young men, flying the mail was a great adventure. Lindbergh began his career as an airmail pilot. At that time, landing fields were scarce and airlanes poorly marked. Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover led the campaign in the 20s for the development of municipal airports and began building airways with radios, beacon lights, emergency landing fields, and weather services. But flying the mail was still a risky business. Almost everybody in the 20s was fascinated with flight. And during the decade, a lot of us got our first chance to fly. 10 million Americans attended air shows and paid barnstorming pilots $5 for a 5-minute flight. Lindbergh's flight to Paris convinced many that air transportation was practical. By the late 20s, there were dozens of small airlines carrying passengers. Pan American World Airways became the first international passenger carrier in 1928. For $50, you could fly Pan Am from Key West to Havana. It had only been 25 years since the Wright brothers had shown that flight was possible. Now, aviation technology was beginning to give us all a new perspective. Though the 20s was a decade of enormous change, some things remained the same. Kids still played baseball on the sandlot behind the school, and younger kids spent hours on the slides and swings. The 20s were carefree years for many of these children of the new prosperity. In later years, they would look back and remember their childhood as a time of hope and promise. It was an age of change, but even as the decade ended, almost no one could imagine the greater changes yet to come.